A young nurse saves a man's life, never realizing he's a secret millionaire, searching for a wife. To her, he's just another patient, battered, silent, and alone. But every night, she sits by his side, sharing stories, pouring out her heart, never knowing he's listening to every word. As he falls for her in secret, she has no idea her kindness is being written into his will and into his heart. But when the truth comes out, will she walk away? Or will love be enough to heal what money never could? What happens when a man who has everything realizes she's the one thing he can't buy? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sophie Hart's fingers curled around her fourth cup of coffee for the night. The bitter liquid had long since lost its warmth, much like the dreary April evening outside the hospital windows. Rain pelted against the glass in steady streams, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the usual bustle of Mount Sinai's emergency room. "You really don't have to stay, Sophie," her colleague Maria called from the nurse's station, already shouldering her bag to leave. "I can handle the rest of the shift." Sophie waved her off with a gentle smile. "Go home to your kids, Maria. Tommy's got that big science fair tomorrow, right? You need the rest more than I do." The truth was, Sophie didn't mind the extra hours. The hospital had become more of a home to her than her small apartment in Queens. Here, among the sanitized halls and beeping monitors, she knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. Here, she could focus on helping others instead of dwelling on the empty spaces in her own life. Humming softly to herself, she moved through the supply room with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved automatically, restocking gauze, checking expiration dates on medications, and organizing syringes into neat rows. The familiar tune was an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a comfort on long nights like these. 3 more supply kits, she muttered to herself, making a mental note. The coffee might have been stale, but at least it kept her alert enough to notice these details. She glanced at her watch. 11:42 p.m. The night shift was usually quieter, though in New York City's biggest trauma center, quiet was always a relative term. The relative peace shattered as the emergency bay doors burst open, bringing with them a gust of cold rain and controlled chaos. "Male, early 30s, head trauma and possible internal injuries." A paramedic's voice cut through the sudden commotion. "BP dropping, unresponsive since seen." Sophie was already moving, her tired muscles suddenly charged with adrenaline. The patient on the gurney was a mess of blood and rain-soaked clothes, his dark hair matted against his forehead. Despite the chaos, she caught sight of his face. Strong features, now pale and slack, with a nasty gash across his temple. "What happened?" she asked, falling into step with the paramedics as they rushed him toward Trauma Room 1. "Subway hero," the female paramedic replied, her voice tight with urgency but tinged with admiration. "Witnesses say he pushed a kid out of the way of an oncoming train, took a hard hit to the head on the tracks. The child's fine, but he's been out cold since impact." Sophie's heart clenched as they transferred him to the trauma bed. Some heroes wore capes, others apparently wore rain-soaked business suits. She cut away his shirt with practiced precision, while Dr. Chen began his initial assessment. "No wallet, no phone," another paramedic reported, placing a small evidence bag on the side table. "Just this around his neck." Sophie glanced at the bag as she attached monitoring leads to the man's chest. Inside was a silver chain with what looked like an old subway token hanging from it. Even through the plastic, she could make out an engraving. "Find your way back." The next hour was a blur of focused activity. Sophie moved with the well-orchestrated team, anticipating needs before they were voiced, keeping track of vital signs, and assisting as they stabilized their mysterious patient. Her hands remained steady even as her mind wandered to the token's message. Who was he trying to find his way back to? The CT scan revealed a severe cerebral contusion, and before long, they were rushing him to emergency surgery. Sophie watched as they wheeled him away, his face now peaceful under the harsh fluorescent lights. She found herself hoping he had someone out there looking for him, someone who would notice his empty chair at breakfast tomorrow morning. 3 hours later, Sophie stood in the coma unit, checking the monitors beside his bed. The surgery had gone well, but now came the waiting game. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft whir of machines helping him breathe. She studied his face, now cleaned of blood and partially hidden behind bandages. "Who are you, subway hero?" she whispered, adjusting his blanket with gentle hands. The question hung in the still air, unanswered. Making her final checks, Sophie's eyes drifted to the empty bedside table. In all her years of nursing, she'd seen how important it was for coma patients to have a connection to the outside world. Voices, touches, reminders that they weren't alone. This man had no photos, no cards, no worried family members keeping vigil. Making a decision, Sophie pulled her small notepad from her scrub pocket, the one she always carried for patient notes. She settled into the chair beside his bed and began to write, her pen flowing across the paper with purpose. "Dear subway hero, you don't know me, but I was one of the nurses who helped take care of you tonight. They say you saved a child's life today. In a city where people barely look up from their phones, you looked up and saw someone who needed help. That makes you pretty special in my book. The doctors did a great job fixing you up, but now it's your turn to do some work. That token around your neck says find your way back. I don't know what or who you're trying to find your way back to, but I hope you know there are people here waiting for you to come back too. I hope you come back soon. Sophie, your night nurse." She folded the note carefully and tucked it into the bedside drawer. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky. Sophie took one last look at her patient before heading out to finish her extended shift, wondering what other secrets this unconscious hero might be keeping. The next day, Sophie pushed through the hospital's revolving doors at 6:45 a.m., stifling a yawn. The few hours of sleep she'd managed to get hadn't been nearly enough, but her mind kept drifting back to the mysterious subway hero. Her comfortable sneakers squeaked against the freshly mopped floor as she made her way to the locker room. "You look like you could use this," called Janet, the day shift charge nurse, holding out a steaming cup of coffee from the good cart in the lobby, not the break room sludge. "You're an angel," Sophie said, gratefully accepting the cup. The rich aroma alone helped clear some of the fog from her tired mind. "Any changes with our John Doe from last night?" Janet shook her head. "Stable through the night. Dr. Patel, the neurologist, is doing rounds soon if you want to catch him." After changing into fresh scrubs, Sophie headed straight to the coma unit. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the quiet room. The subway hero lay just as she'd left him hours ago, peaceful and still. The steady rise and fall of his chest matched the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. She checked his vitals, noting them in his chart with practiced efficiency. His color looked better today, the pallor of shock replaced by a healthier tone. The swelling around his head wound had gone down slightly, though dark bruises still spread across his temple like watercolors. "Good morning," she said softly, adjusting his blanket. "I hope you had sweet dreams." "Ah, Nurse Hart." Dr. Patel's voice came from the doorway. The neurologist entered, his kind eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How's our hero doing this morning?" They reviewed the patient's status together. The CT scans showed significant trauma, but no permanent damage that they could detect. Still, the brain was complicated, and comas were unpredictable. "Could be days before he wakes up," Dr. Patel explained, making notes in the chart. "Could be weeks. The brain heals in its own time." Sophie nodded, trying not to let disappointment show on her face. "But his chances are good?" "The surgery went well, and he's young and healthy. Those are all points in his favor." Dr. Patel gave her a knowing look. "Just keep talking to him. Sometimes they can hear us, even if they can't respond. Throughout her shift, Sophie found herself drawn back to room 412 during her breaks. The first time, she brought her lunch, a turkey sandwich and an apple, and sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed. "I hope you don't mind some company," she said, unwrapping her sandwich. "It's too nice a day to eat alone." She told him about her morning, the elderly patient who kept trying to escape to go feed his cats, which had already been taken in by his daughter, and the young mother who brought cookies for the entire staff after her son's successful appendectomy. During her afternoon break, she returned with a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird from her locker. "This was my favorite book in high school," she explained, settling into the chair. "My grandmother used to read it to me when I was sick." She opened to the first chapter and began reading aloud, her voice soft but clear. Between patients and rounds, she'd pop in just to give quick updates or share random thoughts. She told him about growing up in a small town in Connecticut, about the treehouse her father built her when she was 8, about the time she tried to rescue a baby bird and ended up covered in mud. "I wanted to be a veterinarian back then," she said with a laugh, checking his IV. "But it turns out I'm better with people than animals. Well, most people. Mr. Jenkins in 415 might disagree. He called me a bossy little thing when I made him take his medicine." The day shift wound down, and Sophie found herself back in room 412 as evening approached. The setting sun painted the walls in warm oranges and pinks. She pulled out her notepad and began to write, speaking softly as her pen moved across the paper. "Dear Subway Hero, the doctors say you're doing well, even if you're taking your time waking up. I don't blame you. The world can be pretty overwhelming sometimes, but I can't help wondering what you're dreaming about in there. What memories are keeping you company? What do you miss the most? I've been telling you stories all day, but I bet you have some good ones of your own. That token around your neck must mean something special. Maybe someday you'll tell me about it. Until then, sweet dreams. Sophie." She tucked the note into the drawer with the first one and stood to leave. "I'll see you tomorrow," she promised, patting his hand gently. The night shift was busy with new admissions, but Sophie still managed to check on him between rounds. Around midnight, during a rare quiet moment, she stopped by room 412 again. The monitors beeped steadily in the dim light as she recorded his vitals. A slight movement caught her eye. His fingers twitched against the white sheet. She watched carefully, holding her breath, but they remained still. Probably just a reflex, she told herself, trying not to get too excited. She'd seen enough coma patients to know that small movements didn't always mean anything. Sophie stepped out briefly to check on another patient down the hall, humming her grandmother's lullaby to herself as she reviewed some charts at the nurse's station. The sound echoed softly through the quiet corridor. In room 412, unknown to anyone, the patient's eyes flickered open for just a moment. He caught a glimpse of the shadowy room, the soft glow of monitoring equipment, and heard the distant melody of Sophie's humming. His heart rate increased slightly, but before any alarms could sound, his eyes closed again, his consciousness slipping back into the comfortable darkness. When Sophie returned to his room moments later, still humming the gentle tune, everything appeared unchanged. She adjusted his blanket and checked his monitors one last time, unaware that for a brief moment her patient had awakened to the sound of her voice. Days later, the early morning sun hadn't yet risen when Sophie entered the hospital the next day. She'd woken up before her alarm, her mind already on room 412 and its mysterious occupant. Her footsteps echoed through the quiet corridors as she made her way to the locker room, changed into fresh scrubs, and gathered her things for the day ahead. "Good morning, Subway Hero," she said softly, entering his room. The familiar beeping of monitors greeted her as she checked his vitals. "You're looking better today. The swelling's gone down even more." She settled into the chair beside his bed, cradling her coffee cup. "I brought the good coffee today, from that little place around the corner. Their vanilla lattes are worth getting up early for." She took a sip and sighed contentedly. Though between you and me, I probably would have been here early anyway. Ethan lay still, his breathing steady and controlled, though his heart skipped slightly at the warmth in her voice. He'd been awake for hours, watching the night shift through barely opened eyes, learning their routines. But Sophie was different. Her presence filled the room with a gentle energy that made his self-imposed silence both harder and more necessary. "You won't believe what happened yesterday after my shift," Sophie continued, settling more comfortably in her chair. "Remember that supervisor I told you about, Ms. Roberts? Well, she decided to implement this new charting system without consulting any of the actual nurses who'd have to use it. She described the chaos that ensued. Missing records, double entries, frustrated staff. Her voice carried a mix of exasperation and tired amusement. I mean, would it kill her to ask our opinion once in a while? We're the ones doing the actual work." Ethan listened intently, fighting the urge to smile at her animated descriptions. Her frustration reminded him of his own battles with bureaucracy, before everything had fallen apart, before his brother had... But you know what's funny? Sophie's voice pulled him back from darker thoughts. A few years ago, this would have really gotten to me. I would have taken it personally, stayed up all night worrying about it. Now, she laughed softly. Now I just think about coming here, telling you about it. Somehow that makes it better. She paused, and Ethan could hear her shifting in her chair. Is that weird? Talking to someone who can't answer back? Maybe it is. But there's something, I don't know, peaceful about it. Real, somehow. A call light buzzed in the hallway, and Sophie stood with a small sigh. Duty calls. But I'll be back later. I brought my sketchbook. Thought I might try drawing while we chat. I'm not very good, but my grandmother always said it's the trying that counts. After she left, Ethan carefully opened his eyes, scanning the room. His gaze fell on the drawer where she kept her notes. He'd read each one multiple times during the quiet night hours, tracing her neat handwriting with his fingers, memorizing every word. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Other nurses came and went, checking equipment, administering medication. Doctors conducted their rounds, discussing his case in clinical terms. But Ethan waited for Sophie's voice, distinguishing it easily from the hospital's general noise. She returned during her lunch break, the scratch of pencil on paper accompanying her latest story about her grandmother's garden. She grew the most amazing tomatoes, Sophie said. But she was terrible at remembering what she'd planted where. We'd find cucumber vines growing through the roses and beans climbing up the fence posts. Ethan pictured it clearly. A wild, happy garden, so different from the sterile perfection of his former life. Everything in his world had been carefully controlled, every interaction measured for potential gain or loss, until it had all collapsed around him, teaching him the true price of trust. When Sophie left for her afternoon rounds, Ethan waited several minutes before reaching for the drawer. A new note lay on top of the others, the paper still crisp. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Dear Subway Hero, I think you're kind. You saved that child. That means something. In a world where people often look the other way, you acted. You risked everything for a stranger. I hope you know how special that is. Sophie. The words blurred as Ethan blinked back unexpected tears. She was wrong. He wasn't special or kind. He was a coward hiding in silence, afraid to face a world that had only ever wanted him for his money or his influence. But her words touched something deep inside him, a part he thought had died along with his trust in others. Throughout the afternoon, he listened as Sophie shared more stories between her rounds. She told him about her failed engagement to a doctor who'd chosen his career over their relationship, about her dreams of opening a small clinic someday, about her favorite spot in Central Park where she went to think. Each word, each laugh, each quiet moment of vulnerability felt like a gift. There was no agenda in her kindness, no hidden motive in her care. She spoke to him not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as a person worthy of compassion simply because he existed. As evening approached, Sophie made one final visit. "Just wanted to say goodnight," she said softly. "I made you something. Well, tried to anyway." He heard the sound of paper being folded, then the drawer opening and closing. After she left, Ethan reached for the drawer again. The new note was different from the others. A simple sketch of a stethoscope, drawn with careful attention to detail. Below it, Sophie had written, "Sometimes it's the quiet hearts that are the strongest." Tears fell freely now, spotting the paper. Ethan pressed his hand to his mouth to stifle a sob. In all his years of success, all his accumulated wealth and power, no one had ever seen him so clearly or so kindly. He knew he should wake up, should stop this deception. But the thought of losing these moments, of seeing Sophie's warmth turn to disappointment or, worse, calculation when she discovered his true identity, was unbearable. For the first time in years, someone was speaking to his heart, not his bank account. So he carefully returned the note to its drawer and closed his eyes, choosing to remain in this peaceful limbo where genuine connection was still possible. Just for a little while longer, he told himself. Just until he could find the courage to face reality again. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting thin stripes of light across Ethan's room. 1 week had passed since the subway accident, and the routine had settled into something familiar, almost comforting. Sophie pushed the door open with her hip, carefully balancing 2 coffee cups. "Morning, subway hero," she called out cheerfully. "I brought us both coffee today, black for you, whenever you're ready for it." She set 1 cup on his bedside table, its rich aroma filling the sterile air. Taking her usual seat, Sophie wrapped her hands around her own vanilla latte. "Pickle did the funniest thing this morning," she said, referring to her orange tabby cat. "He somehow got into the bathroom cabinet and knocked over all my cotton balls. When I found him, he was batting them around like some kind of cotton ball king." She laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. As she spoke, Ethan focused on keeping his breathing steady, though his lips twitched at her story. He'd grown to love hearing about Pickle's adventures, picturing the mischievous cat through Sophie's descriptions. She hummed quietly while checking his vitals, the same melody she always used, an old lullaby her grandmother had taught her. The familiar tune wrapped around them both like a comfortable blanket. Sophie adjusted his actual blanket, tucking it more securely around his shoulders with gentle hands. "Your color's better today," she observed, her fingers brushing lightly against his wrist as she checked his pulse. "The bruising is almost gone." Throughout the day, Sophie returned between her rounds, sharing stories about difficult patients, hospital gossip, and more tales of Pickle's escapades. During one visit, she held his hand while describing her favorite coffee shop around the corner. Ethan felt her warm fingers entwined with his and made a decision. Ever so slightly, he squeezed back. Sophie's words stopped mid-sentence. Did you just squeeze my hand?" Her voice trembled with excitement. She squeezed again, and Ethan responded with another faint pressure. "Dr. Martinez," she called out, spotting the neurologist passing by. "Come quick, he's responding." The doctor performed a series of tests, noting Ethan's increased responsiveness to stimuli. "This is very encouraging," he said, making notes in the chart. "Keep talking to him, Nurse Hart. Whatever you're doing seems to be working." Sophie's face glowed with joy. "Did you hear that?" she asked Ethan after the doctor left. "You're getting better. I knew you would." That night, after Sophie's shift ended, Ethan carefully opened his eyes. He'd been doing this more frequently during the quiet hours, sometimes writing in a small notebook he'd asked a night nurse to bring him. Page after page filled with words he wanted to tell Sophie, but couldn't bring himself to share. "Thank you for the coffee every morning," one note read. "I haven't had plain black coffee since college. Everyone always wants to add something fancy to it these days." "Your cat sounds exactly like my childhood pet," said another. I had an orange tabby too. His name was Algorithm. I was a weird kid. Your humming reminds me of my mother, he'd written the night before. I'd forgotten how much I missed that kind of simple kindness. He looked at the growing stack of unsent notes, guilt gnawing at his conscience. Sophie's genuine care deserved better than his deception, but the thought of losing these precious moments paralyzed him with fear. The next morning, Sophie arrived with their usual coffees. "Guess what?" she said, settling into her chair. "Remember that awful charting system? They're finally scrapping it. Turns out even Ms. Roberts couldn't defend it after 3 different departments complained." Ethan responded with a slight movement of his head, just enough to be noticeable. Sophie gasped in delight. "You can hear me, can't you?" she said softly. "You're really coming back to us." Throughout the day, Ethan showed more small signs of recovery. His fingers would twitch when Sophie spoke. His breathing would change rhythm when she hummed. Each response made her smile brighter. During her afternoon break, Sophie sat beside him, reading from To Kill a Mockingbird. They were nearly finished with it now. As she read, Ethan found himself mouthing the words silently along with her, having memorized many passages from her previous readings. When evening came, Sophie prepared to leave for the day. She pulled out her notebook, ready to write her usual note. But something made her pause. She opened the drawer where she kept her previous notes and froze. There, on top of her familiar papers, lay a new note. The handwriting was different, stronger, more angular than her own. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. "I'm awake. I've been listening. I just didn't want you to stop talking." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned toward the bed. Ethan's eyes were open, clear and alert, fixed directly on her face. In them she saw fear, guilt, and something else, a desperate hope that mirrored her own stunned expression. The ceramic coffee cup hit the floor with a sharp crack, dark liquid spreading across the pristine hospital tiles. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide and fixed on Ethan's face. His eyes, a deep brown she hadn't noticed before, met hers with an uncertain smile, small but unmistakably conscious. "Code Blue, room 412, called out Nancy, a passing nurse who had glimpsed the scene through the doorway. Within seconds, the quiet room erupted into controlled chaos as medical staff rushed in, their shoes squeaking against the wet floor. Sophie backed away from the bed, her heart pounding. She pressed herself against the wall, watching as Dr. Martinez quickly approached Ethan's bedside, penlight already in hand. The neurologist's face showed careful professional interest as he examined his patient. "Mr. Doe, can you hear me?" Dr. Martinez asked, shining the light in Ethan's eyes. "Blink twice if you understand." Ethan blinked deliberately, twice. His gaze kept drifting back to Sophie, who stood frozen in place, her scrubs stained with splashed coffee. "Can you speak?" the doctor prompted. Ethan's throat worked for a moment. When his voice finally came, it was rough from disuse. "Hi," he managed, the single word barely above a whisper. The medical team continued their assessment, checking vital signs and responses. Sophie watched as they asked him basic questions. His name, he claimed not to remember. The current year, he shook his head. The last thing he remembered, another head shake. Dr. Martinez made notes on his tablet. "This is fairly common with head trauma," he explained to the room at large. "Post-traumatic amnesia can last anywhere from a few hours to several weeks. The important thing is that he's awake and responding well to stimuli." Sophie felt her professional training kick in, helping her regain composure. She stepped forward to assist with the examination, but Dr. Martinez touched her arm. "Nurse Hart, you've been here since his admission. Why don't you take a break? We've got this covered." She nodded numbly and slipped out of the room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The note he'd left burned in her memory. I'm awake. I've been listening. But now he claimed not to remember anything. Something didn't add up. When she returned an hour later, the room had settled. Ethan lay propped up slightly, looking tired but alert. A fresh water cup sat on his bedside table, and the coffee mess had been cleaned away. "How are you feeling?" she asked, maintaining a professional distance. Her usual warmth felt awkward now, trapped behind uncertainty. "Tired," he replied softly. His voice was clearer after some water, but he kept his answers brief. "Head hurts." Sophie checked his IV and adjusted his pain medication. "That's normal after what you've been through. Do you remember anything about the accident?" Ethan's eyes clouded. "No," he said, looking down at his hands. "Nothing." Throughout the day, Sophie continued her rounds, checking on Ethan with less frequency than before. When she did visit, she kept their interactions clinical and brief. Gone were the stories about Pickle, the shared coffee moments, the comfortable silences filled with her humming. Yet she couldn't help noticing how Ethan's eyes followed her movements, how he seemed to lean slightly toward her voice whenever she spoke. There was something in his expression, a yearning that made her wonder about the truth of his amnesia. During her afternoon visit, she caught him mouthing the words while she read his chart aloud, as if he knew medical terminology. When she mentioned it, he quickly looked away, claiming his throat was just dry. Ethan, for his part, felt the guilt building with each interaction. He watched Sophie maintain her professional distance, missing the easy warmth of her previous visits. Several times he opened his mouth to confess, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he'd been lying because her presence made him feel human again. That her stories had become the highlight of his empty days. The night shift brought quiet to the hospital floor. Sophie's shift was ending, but she found herself drawn to Ethan's room one last time. The soft glow of monitors painted shadows on the walls as she entered. Ethan appeared to be sleeping, his breathing steady and deep. Sophie pulled out her notebook, a habit she couldn't quite break, and began to write. The pen hesitated over the paper as she struggled to find words that felt right in this new reality. Finally, she wrote, "I hope you find your way back, all the way back." She stood there, note in hand, uncertain whether to place it in the drawer as she had so many times before. The familiar action felt different now, loaded with questions she couldn't answer. "I missed your voice." The words came so softly that Sophie wasn't sure she'd heard them at first. She turned to find Ethan watching her, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the monitors. Those 4 words hung in the air between them, heavy with possible meanings. Was he speaking of the hours since he'd awakened, when she'd withdrawn into professional courtesy? Or was it an admission of the days he'd spent listening, pretending to be unconscious? Sophie stood perfectly still, the note clutched in her hand, searching his face for answers. Ethan met her gaze steadily, but his expression remained carefully neutral, maintaining the ambiguity of his statement. The moment stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. Sophie's fingers tightened around the paper, creating tiny creases in its surface. She could feel her heart beating rapidly in her chest, unsure whether to trust her instincts or maintain professional distance. Later, the morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting thin stripes of light across Ethan's bed. Sophie entered the room carrying fresh linens and a determined smile. "Good morning? Ready to try sitting up today?" she asked, setting down her supplies. Ethan nodded, though his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sophie approached his bedside with practiced efficiency. "Okay, we'll take this nice and slow. I'll help you, but let me know if you feel dizzy or uncomfortable." She adjusted the bed's angle first, then carefully helped Ethan shift his position. Her hands were steady and warm as she supported his back, guiding him upward. The movement brought them close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her lavender hand lotion. "There we go," Sophie encouraged as Ethan found his balance. "How's that feeling?" "Different," he managed, fighting a wave of dizziness. But good different. Sophie adjusted his pillows, making sure he was properly supported. The dizziness should pass in a minute. Just keep breathing, normally. They settled into a comfortable silence as Ethan adjusted to his new perspective. The room looked different from this angle, more real somehow, less like the ceiling-focused view he'd had for days. "So," Sophie said, checking his IV line, "what kind of music do you like? Maybe we can get you a radio or something." Ethan considered carefully, remembering to maintain his supposed amnesia. "I'm not sure, but that song you hum sometimes, it sounds familiar." "Oh," Sophie laughed, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "That old thing? It's just something my grandmother used to sing. Speaking of which, it's getting pretty gloomy outside. Looks like another storm coming." "I like the rain," Ethan said softly, watching droplets begin to gather on the window. "At least, I think I do." Sophie pulled up a chair, her morning tasks completed. She seemed more relaxed now, less guarded than she'd been since his awakening. "You know what's funny," she said, absently straightening his blanket. "Rain always reminds me of my ex. He proposed to me during a thunderstorm, if you can believe it, right in the middle of the hospital parking lot." She let out a short, bitter laugh. Should have known it wouldn't last. Who proposes in a parking lot? Ethan watched her face carefully, noting the hurt that still lingered in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked gently. "Oh, you know, the usual story. Boy meets girl. Boy happens to be a brilliant neurosurgeon. Girl is just a nurse." She made air quotes with her fingers. "Turned out he was brilliant at surgery, but terrible at being human. Found him with one of the pharmaceutical reps in his office." She shook her head. "That was 2 years ago, but sometimes it still stings." Ethan's chest tightened with an urge to tell her everything, about his own betrayals, about how he understood the pain of being valued for the wrong reasons. The words pressed against his lips, but he held them back. How could he tell her now, after lying for so long? Over the next few days, their conversations grew longer, deeper. Sophie brought him books from the hospital library, and they discussed their favorite characters. She'd sit with him during her breaks, sharing stories about difficult patients or funny moments with her cat. One afternoon, while helping him with his physical therapy exercises, Sophie asked, "What foods do you miss most?" Sometimes familiar tastes can help trigger memories. "Grilled cheese," Ethan answered without thinking. It had been his comfort food during long coding sessions in his early startup days. The next morning, Sophie appeared with a paper bag. "I made an executive decision," she announced, pulling out a carefully wrapped sandwich. "Hospital food is terrible for recovery. This is much better medicine." The smell of melted cheese and toasted bread filled the room. Ethan took a bite and closed his eyes, savoring the simple pleasure. "This is perfect," he said softly. "You must have been a teacher or something," Sophie mused, watching him eat. "You have that thoughtful, quiet way about you. Definitely not some loud corporate type." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. "Maybe," he said, focusing on the sandwich. "I guess we'll find out eventually." Sophie smiled. "No rush. You know, it's kind of nice getting to know someone from scratch. No preconceptions, no baggage." That evening, after her rounds, Sophie sat in Ethan's room writing in her notebook. The habit had survived their changing dynamic, though now she sometimes shared what she wrote. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking up from her writing. "It's weird, isn't it? How life works out sometimes." She continued writing for a moment before carefully tearing out the page. Ethan watched as she folded the note and walked to the drawer. "If we'd met under different circumstances, I think I would have liked you anyway," she read aloud softly before placing it inside. After she left, Ethan waited until the night shift nurses had completed their rounds. Then he carefully got out of bed. He was steady enough now to manage short walks, and made his way to the small staff lounge where he knew there was a fireplace. He found a pen and paper and began to write. "Dear Sophie, my name is Ethan Vale. I used to run a tech company worth billions until my own brother betrayed me. I've been running ever since, trying to find something real in a world that only cared about what I owned. And then I heard your voice in the darkness." He stared at the words for a long time, his hand trembling slightly. Then he walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held the paper to the flame. He watched as his truth curled and blackened, turning to ash. When he returned to his room, he found Sophie doing a final check. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting his slightly labored breathing from the walk. "Just needed to stretch my legs," he said, settling back into bed. "Well, don't overdo it," she advised, adjusting his blanket. "We've got plenty of time to get you back on your feet." Ethan nodded, the ghost of his burned confession still bitter on his tongue. Sophie gave him one last smile before heading out, humming her grandmother's tune as she went. Sophie's footsteps echoed through the sterile hospital corridor as she made her way to her supervisor's office. The morning had started normally enough. Rounds, medication checks, her usual visit with Ethan. But the tersely worded message from Dr. Martinez had set her nerves on edge. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, straightening her scrubs unconsciously. "Come in," Dr. Martinez called out. Sophie entered to find her supervisor sitting behind her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a file. The office felt smaller than usual, its walls lined with medical certificates seeming to close in around her. "Have a seat, Sophie." Dr. Martinez gestured to the chair across from her desk, her expression unreadable. Sophie sat down, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Martinez removed her glasses and fixed Sophie with a direct stare. "We need to discuss your involvement with the patient in room 412. Mr. John Doe." Sophie's stomach tightened. "Ethan, has there been a problem with his care?" "The quality of care isn't the issue." Dr. Martinez's tone was careful, measured. "However, it's been brought to my attention that you've been spending an excessive amount of time with this particular patient. Several staff members have expressed concern about what they perceive as an unprofessional attachment." Heat crept up Sophie's neck. "Unprofessional? I've done nothing inappropriate. I'm simply providing attentive care to a trauma patient with memory loss." "The notes, Sophie." Dr. Martinez tapped a folder on her desk. "The extended visits during your breaks. The personal conversations. The food from outside the hospital. These actions go beyond standard patient care." "He needed support," Sophie defended, her voice rising slightly. "He was alone, confused, without any family or friends. Studies show that consistent social interaction improves recovery outcomes in trauma patients." "I understand your intentions, doctor," Martinez said, her expression softening slightly. "But we have to maintain professional boundaries. Your interactions with this patient are being closely monitored. Any further deviation from standard care protocols could result in disciplinary action." Sophie felt as if she'd been slapped. "Are you threatening to suspend me?" "I'm trying to protect you," Dr. Martinez replied. "And the hospital. These situations can become complicated very quickly. I suggest you take a step back and maintain a more professional distance." Sophie left the office in a daze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She'd always prided herself on her professionalism, on going above and beyond for her patients. Now those very qualities were being used against her. Meanwhile, Ethan was attempting his daily walk around the ward when he overheard two nurses chatting near the supply closet. He slowed his pace, steadying himself against the wall as their words drifted toward him. "Did you hear about Sophie?" one nurse whispered. "Martinez called her in this morning. Apparently someone reported her for getting too close to that amnesia patient." "No way!" Sophie's always so professional. Well, I heard they might suspend her if she doesn't back off. Can't say I'm surprised. She's been spending way too much time with him, writing him notes and everything. Ethan's heart began to race, his palms growing sweaty against the wall. This was his fault. His deception was now threatening Sophie's career. The weight of his lies suddenly felt unbearable. He made his way back to his room, his mind churning with guilt and fear. He had to do something, had to fix this before Sophie suffered any consequences for his selfishness. Hours passed like molasses. Ethan watched the clock, dreading and yearning for Sophie's appearance in equal measure. When she finally entered his room that afternoon, he could see the strain around her eyes, though she tried to maintain her usual cheerful demeanor. "Time to adjust your pillows," she said, moving to his bedside. Her hands were efficient but gentle as she reached behind him. The words burst from Ethan's lips before he could stop them. "I've been awake for weeks. I've been lying to everyone, including you." Sophie's hands froze mid-motion. The silence in the room became deafening. Slowly, she withdrew her hands and stepped back from the bed. "What?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan's throat felt tight, but he forced himself to continue. "I woke up that night when you were humming in the hallway. I've been conscious ever since. I couldn't bear to lose what we had. Your stories, your kindness." Sophie's face drained of color. She took another step back, her hands trembling slightly. "You've been pretending this whole time? Listening to me pour my heart out, watching me worry about your recovery, letting me risk my job to help you?" "Sophie, please!" Ethan reached for her, but she jerked away. "I never meant to hurt you. Your voice, your presence. It was the first real connection I'd felt in years." "Why?" The word came out broken, filled with pain and betrayal. Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why would you do this?" Ethan struggled to find the right words to explain the complexity of his feelings and fears. "I was scared. Of going back to my old life, of losing this connection, of seeing disappointment in your eyes when you learned who I really was." But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. Her face had hardened into a mask of hurt and humiliation. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps quick and uneven as she disappeared down the hallway. That evening, a different nurse brought Ethan his discharge papers. His vitals were stable, his recovery progressing well enough for outpatient care. As he packed the few belongings he'd accumulated during his stay, his eyes kept drifting to the drawer where Sophie's notes were stored. He waited until the last possible moment, hoping she might appear, hoping for a chance to explain everything properly. But Sophie never came. The night shift began, and still, there was no sign of her. Finally, a hospital volunteer arrived with a wheelchair, standard protocol for discharge. As Ethan was wheeled toward the exit, he caught a glimpse of Sophie at the far end of the corridor, speaking with another nurse. She didn't look his way. The automatic doors slid open, and Ethan was rolled out into the evening air. His chest ached with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. The volunteer helped him into a waiting taxi, and just like that, his time at the hospital, his time with Sophie, was over. The morning light filtered weakly through the hospital windows as Sophie stood in her supervisor's office for the second time in 2 days. This time, the atmosphere was even heavier, the silence more oppressive. "I'm sorry, Sophie, but we have no choice," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "Given the serious nature of the complaint and the evidence presented, we need to suspend you pending a full investigation." Sophie's hands trembled as she accepted the official notice. "Evidence? What evidence?" "Multiple documented instances of inappropriate contact with a patient, violation of professional boundaries, and potential compromise of patient care." Dr. Martinez read from the paper in front of her. "The investigation will take approximately 2 weeks. Until then, you're suspended with partial pay." Sophie felt numb as she walked to her locker, carrying an empty cardboard box from the supply room. The familiar hallways seemed foreign now, the faces of her colleagues either averted or filled with poorly concealed pity. Some whispered as she passed, their voices carrying fragments of gossip that cut like tiny knives. Her locker stood at the end of a long row, just as it had for the past 3 years. But something was different. The nameplate that had proudly displayed Sophie Hart, RN, was missing, leaving only faint adhesive marks on the metal surface. The small act of erasure hit her harder than the suspension notice. She mechanically packed her belongings, spare scrubs, comfortable shoes, the small collection of thank you cards from recovered patients, and her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. At the bottom of the locker lay a stack of blank notepaper, the kind she'd used to write her notes to Ethan. Sophie's throat tightened as she crumpled them and threw them in the trash. The walk to Ethan's former room was inevitable. It lay between her locker and the exit. Room 412 stood empty now, stripped and sanitized, waiting for its next occupant. The drawer where she'd kept their notes was empty, wiped clean of their shared secrets. Sophie paused in the doorway, remembering the sound of his voice when he'd finally spoken, the way his eyes had held hers, full of guilt and something else she hadn't wanted to name. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan paced the polished floors of his penthouse apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, but he barely noticed the spectacular skyline. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Sophie, replaying their last interaction over and over. The space around him felt too large, too empty after the intimate confines of the hospital room. His private elevator, his state-of-the-art security system, his carefully curated art collection, all of it seemed meaningless now. He'd traded genuine connection for cold comfort once again. Sitting at his desk, Ethan accessed systems he hadn't touched since walking away from his company. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he dug deeper into the hospital's records, searching for the source of the complaint against Sophie. It took hours, but he finally traced it back to a senior nurse who'd always resented Sophie's popularity with patients and staff. With a few careful phone calls to old contacts, Ethan set things in motion. He made sure the investigation would find no wrongdoing, that Sophie's record would remain unblemished. He did it all anonymously, knowing she would reject any help that came directly from him. He tried calling her cell phone, only to find the number disconnected. His messages to her email bounced back undelivered. Sophie had cut off all contact, disappearing as completely as he once had from his own life. Days turned into weeks. Sophie, despite being cleared of all charges and offered full reinstatement, declined to return to the hospital. The memories were too raw, the trust too thoroughly broken. Instead, she accepted a position at Riverside Senior Care, a small facility in a quiet suburb an hour outside the city. The work was different, slower paced, more personal. Her patients were elderly residents who needed as much emotional support as medical care. She learned their stories, their habits, their small daily victories and struggles, but she kept herself carefully distant, building invisible walls around her heart. Her new routine became a shield: wake up, drive to work, care for her patients with professional kindness, drive home, repeat. No more staying late to chat with patients, no more sharing personal stories, no more writing notes. She was efficient, competent, and completely closed off. One evening, as Sophie helped Mrs. Peterson, a particularly frail resident, get ready for bed, a knock at the door interrupted their usual routine. "Come in," Sophie called out, adjusting Mrs. Peterson's pillows. "The volunteer is here with evening tea," announced Nancy, one of the night nurses. Sophie's back was to the door as she tucked the blanket around Mrs. Peterson's shoulders. "Just set it on the side table, please. I'll help Mrs. Peterson with it in a moment." "Actually," a familiar voice said softly, "I'd like to help, if that's okay." Sophie's hands froze on the blanket. Her heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful force. Slowly, she turned around. Ethan stood in the doorway, holding a tea tray. He wore simple jeans and a gray sweater. No trace of the wealthy tech CEO he really was. His hair was slightly longer than it had been in the hospital, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. There were no security guards, no expensive accessories, nothing to separate him from any other volunteer at the facility. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Peterson looked between them with keen interest, sensing the tension in the air. "What are you doing here?" Sophie finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The next morning dawned gray and chilly at Riverside Senior Care. Sophie arrived early, her hands wrapped around a travel mug of coffee, steeling herself for what she knew lay ahead. As she walked through the front doors, her eyes immediately caught sight of Ethan, or Eli, as he'd introduced himself to the staff, arranging fresh flowers in the common room. She kept walking, her shoes squeaking slightly on the freshly mopped floor. Her gaze swept past him, as if he were just another piece of furniture, though her heart hammered traitorously in her chest. She could feel his eyes following her, but he made no attempt to speak or approach. The morning rounds proceeded as usual. Sophie checked vitals, administered medications, and changed dressings with mechanical precision. When Ethan appeared in Mrs. Peterson's room with breakfast trays, Sophie merely adjusted her patient's pillows and stepped aside, allowing him to place the food without acknowledgement. "Oh, thank you, dear," Mrs. Peterson said to Ethan, her wrinkled face lighting up. "Such a nice young man, isn't he, Sophie?" Sophie busied herself with checking Mrs. Peterson's chart. "Your blood pressure is much better today," she said, deliberately ignoring the question. Throughout the day, their paths crossed like this, in doorways, along corridors, in the small staff kitchen. Each time, Sophie maintained her careful bubble of silence, speaking only to patients and other staff members. Ethan, for his part, seemed to understand. He kept his distance, focusing instead on the countless small tasks that needed doing around the facility. By the end of the week, Ethan had established his own quiet routine. He arrived early each morning, bringing fresh pastries for the residents. He fixed squeaky wheelchairs, replaced burnt-out light bulbs, and spent hours in the garden helping the more mobile residents tend to their small plots of vegetables and flowers. The residents adored him, especially Mr. Harrison, a retired Marine with a sharp wit and sharper eyes. Sophie often found him sitting with Ethan in the sunroom, sharing stories and playing chess. "You know," Mr. Harrison said to Sophie one afternoon as she checked his medication, "that boy's been broken by something, like you." His blue eyes, still bright despite his 92 years, studied her face carefully. "Recognizes it in you too, I expect." Sophie's hands stilled momentarily on the pill organizer. "Mr. Harrison, I'm just here to make sure you're taking your heart medication." "Humph," the old Marine grunted. "You young folks think you invented heartache. Let me tell you something about pain, Nurse Sophie. It doesn't get better by pretending it isn't there." As days turned into weeks, Sophie found her rigid defenses beginning to crack, ever so slightly. She noticed how Ethan remembered each resident's preferences without being told. Mrs. Chen's tea with 2 sugars, Mr. Patterson's extra pillow for his arthritis, Ms. Rivera's fondness for classical music during her afternoon nap. One morning, while helping Mr. Thompson with his physical therapy, Sophie struggled to keep the elderly man steady as he practiced with his walker. Without a word, Ethan appeared on Mr. Thompson's other side, providing additional support. Sophie didn't push him away. After that, a subtle shift occurred. When Ethan entered a room where Sophie was working, she no longer tensed quite so noticeably. During busy periods, she would allow him to help her turn patients or change bedding. They developed a wordless choreography, anticipating each other's movements, working in sync despite their silence. The other staff members noticed but said nothing, though Sophie occasionally caught knowing looks between the nurses. Even the residents seemed to sense the change, watching their interactions with poorly concealed interest. "He fixed my radio today," Mrs. Peterson told Sophie during evening medications. Just sat right down with his little toolkit and had it working in no time. Wouldn't even let me thank him properly. Sophie remembered the expensive watch he'd worn in the hospital, worth more than her yearly salary. Now his wrists were bare except for a simple leather band, his hands often marked with dirt from the garden or paint from touching up the walls. 2 months into his volunteer work, Ethan had become such a fixture at Riverside that it was hard to remember what the place had been like without him. He worked tirelessly, never complaining, never drawing attention to himself. The expensive cars and designer clothes that might have hinted at his true identity were nowhere to be seen. Instead, he arrived each day in well-worn jeans and practical shirts, looking more like a handyman than a tech billionaire. One evening, as sunset painted the corridors in soft orange light, Sophie was finishing her rounds. Most residents were settling in for the night, the facility quiet, except for the distant sound of televisions and the occasional laugh from the nurses' station. She entered the small medication room, reaching for Mr. Harrison's chart, just as another hand extended toward the same file. Their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of awareness through Sophie's arm. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Sophie could feel the warmth of Ethan's presence behind her, could smell the faint scent of garden soil and the soap they used in the facility's laundry room. His hand remained frozen near hers, not pressing, not retreating. Finally, Sophie turned to face him. The setting sun through the window cast half his face in shadow, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met hers. He didn't speak, didn't try to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. He simply waited, giving her the space to choose. Sophie drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of all their unspoken words. "This place doesn't need a billionaire," she said quietly. "It just needs someone who shows up." "That's why I'm here," Ethan replied, his voice soft but certain. A week at Riverside Senior Care deepened the understanding between Sophie and Ethan. Their silent cooperation felt normal now, though something had shifted since that moment in the medication room. On her day off, Sophie drove to Metropolitan General Hospital to retrieve items from her locker after a text from Linda. The familiar parking lot now felt foreign. She hurried past the emergency bay where paramedics had once rushed in an unconscious Ethan. In the dusty basement hallway, Sophie found her old locker and opened it with her combination. It was mostly empty except for a few forgotten items. When she pulled open the small metal drawer, her breath caught. The drawer was stuffed with envelopes, all dated in Ethan's neat handwriting. One letter for every day since his discharge. Sophie sank onto a bench and began reading with shaking hands. Each letter answered questions she'd asked during his hospital stay. He wrote about missing her presence, her stories, and her kindness. He revealed his truths about saving the child, his brother's betrayal, and why he'd pretended to stay in a coma. Every letter ended the same way. "Will you have dinner with me?" Sophie gathered all the letters and drove home in a daze. Through the night, she read each one in order, discovering how Ethan had researched senior care facilities to find her, learned maintenance skills to stay near her, and noticed small details about her daily habits. As dawn broke across her window, Sophie finished the final letter, dated yesterday. By morning light, she had made up her mind. The evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine through the care home's garden. Golden sunlight filtered through the old oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the weathered playground equipment. Ethan knelt beside the ancient swing set, his hands covered in dark grease as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn bolt. His button-down shirt, no longer the crisp designer wear of his CEO days, was rolled up at the sleeves, spotted with dirt and honest work. Mr. Jenkins, an 82-year-old resident with a penchant for gardening, sat nearby in his wheelchair, offering commentary that was more entertaining than helpful. "You're doing it all wrong, son," he chuckled, eyes twinkling. "In my day, we'd have had that fixed in minutes." Ethan wiped his brow with his forearm, leaving a smudge of grease across his forehead. His hair, longer now and tousled by the gentle breeze, fell across his eyes. He looked different here, softer somehow, more human. The sharp edges of his former life had been worn smooth by simple work and quiet days. "Well, Mr. Jenkins," Ethan replied with a warm smile, "maybe you should come down here and show me how it's done." He adjusted the wrench, focusing on the rusty bolt that seemed determined to resist his efforts. "Don't tempt me, boy," Mr. Jenkins wheezed with laughter. "My swing-fixing days are behind me. But I sure do miss watching my grandkids on these old things." Ethan paused his work, looking up at the elderly man. "Once I get this fixed, we'll have to invite them over. Make some new memories." The sound of footsteps on the garden path made Ethan look up. His hands froze mid-twist on the bolt, and his breath caught in his throat. Sophie stood there, bathed in the warm evening light. She held a familiar-looking coffee thermos, the same brand she used to bring to his hospital room during those quiet nights when he pretended to sleep. Her nurse's uniform was replaced by casual clothes, jeans, and a soft blue sweater that reminded him of hospital scrubs. Mr. Jenkins, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quietly wheeled himself away, muttering something about checking on his tomato plants. Sophie walked toward them with measured steps, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He slowly stood, wiping his hands nervously on his pants, leaving dark streaks across the fabric. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her lavender hand lotion, the same kind she'd used in the hospital. Without a word, she bent down and set the coffee thermos next to his toolbox. When she straightened, her eyes met his, and the ghost of a smile played at her lips. "Only if you're the one bringing it this time," she said softly. Ethan stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment. The evening breeze rustled through the trees above them, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called. Sophie took a small step closer. "I forgave you before you asked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't know if you'd come back." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he processed what she was saying. All those letters, all those days of silence, all the quiet moments of watching her from afar. They had meant something after all. Moving carefully, as if approaching a wild deer that might startle and flee, Ethan gestured to the newly repaired swing. Sophie nodded, and they both sat down, the old chains creaking slightly under their weight. The metal was still warm from the day's sun, and their shoulders barely touched as they began to sway gently. Neither spoke for a long moment, content to share the peaceful evening air and the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night. Ethan reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar shape he'd carried with him every day since the accident. He pulled out the subway token, the same one he'd worn around his neck that fateful day. But now it was different. Polished to a bright shine, the words, "Find your way back," caught the dying sunlight and seemed to glow. With gentle movements, he took Sophie's hand and pressed the token into her palm. Her fingers closed around it automatically, and she looked down at the small metal disc with wonder. "You were my way back," Ethan said simply. Above them, the sky had begun to paint itself in brilliant oranges and pinks. The evening air filled with the sounds of life, birds calling their final songs, residents laughing from the nearby patio, the gentle creak of the swing as they swayed together. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Instead, they sat side by side, finding more comfort in this shared silence than in any grand gesture. Sophie's thumb traced the engraved words on the token, while Ethan's grease-stained hands rested easily on his knees. The swing moved in a gentle arc, their feet brushing against the ground with each pass. The motion was hypnotic, peaceful, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat finally finding its natural pace. Around them, the garden continued its evening symphony, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of residents, the soft call of birds heading home. In this moment, they were just two people who had found their way through the maze of life's complications, to arrive at something simple and true. Two souls who had learned that sometimes the loudest declarations of love come in the quietest moments of understanding. The setting sun painted everything in soft gold, turning the ordinary garden into something magical. But neither Ethan nor Sophie noticed. They were too absorbed in the simple pleasure of being together, of finally finding peace in each other's silence. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Sophie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.